Looking out the windows of our sanctuary, I see a well-established neighborhood that seems unchanging, that feels like it's always been here. But this is hardly the case. In 2015, when my wife Dodie and I were looking to move to a different house, we visited a home just a few doors south of here. The owner had black and white pictures of the house that were taken before and during construction. It was one of the first houses built south of Pettit and west of Calhoun Street. At that time, everything you saw around us was tall grasses and intermittent trees, from well east of us all the way to the river and beyond. It was a bit jarring to realize that these pictures were taken within my lifetime. As a lifelong resident of Fort Wayne, I can easily recall when, as kids, we rode our bikes past Times Corners on West Jefferson, and we were in the country. I remember when Glenbrook Mall was open ground, bordering a 2-lane asphalt road that had recently been extended and connected to US 30 on the east side. After this connection, it was renamed the Circumurban because it allowed travelers to completely bypass Fort Wayne. People went downtown to shop, and there were now 2 fancy new shopping centers, Northcrest on the far north side and Southgate Plaza, just a few blocks from here. When I started college at IUPUFW, now PFW, there was just a single building on the new Northside campus. When I was growing up, almost the only thing west of I-69, which had not yet been built, and north and east of Coliseum Boulevard, was farmland dotted with small villages. Today, the majority of Allen County's population lives outside these boundaries. Much of central Fort Wayne remains relatively unchanged from my youth, but only a few churches, houses, and commercial buildings in central Fort Wayne remain from earlier in the 1800s. It was only a few generations ago when our 3 rivers ran clean and this whole area was forest land inhabited by Native Americans who lived in and around the village of Kikionga near today's Northside High School. Europeans moved in from the east and they built a fort, Fort Wayne. After the native tribes were subdued and the ground was claimed by settlers, Chief Richardville of the Miami tribe was extended a concession. He became wealthy, controlling the portage between the Maumee River and the Little River that extended the Great Lakes fur trade all the way to the Gulf of America. In 1827, he built a mansion less than a half a mile from here on the other side of the river. Today, it is a museum and is thought to be the oldest native-built European-style building in the Midwest. I'm not a historian, certainly not a historian of the Unitarian Universalist Association, but I do know that we are a changing and evolving religious tradition. There were both Unitarians and Universalists in this area as early as 1837. And while both groups were anti-slavery, neither group supported the right of Native Americans to govern themselves and worship according to their traditions. Certainly, they would have never had symbols of Native American religions such as we have here represented on that mandala over there. In the 1870s, President Grant assigned the task of Christianizing Indians to 13 Protestant denominations. The American Unitarian Universalist, just the Unitarians at the time, became the proud administrators of the Northern Paiute tribe in Utah. When laws were passed in 1883 banning all Native American religions and ceremonies, there was no objection from the Unitarian Association. It was not until the 1970s that the UUA passed formal resolutions opposing the continued exploitation of indigenous peoples. These days, I barely recognize the city of my birth. Likewise, many UUs from the mid-20th century would barely recognize the 2025 version of our faith. Like the city around us, Unitarian Universalism has changed and will continue to change as we grow together towards justice and equity centered on love.
As we begin the transition to autumn, I am struck by the tension between what always happens and how it never happens the same way. I grew up in the part of the country that doesn't really have fall. I grew up outside of Houston, Texas, which has the following seasons: swampy, punishingly hot, and drizzle/annual ice storm. That's it. And I remember my dad, who was from Indiana, used to say that footballs are brown so you could find them in the snow. But none of us ever really got the joke. My first encounter with the real autumn was over a decade ago when I lived in New England. I thought it was the most amazing thing that I'd ever seen. For me, it's always the yellow leaves. The red and the orange are amazing, but the bright saffron ones are the ones that just really get me. And that first experience with the true autumn was transcendent. I didn't know. However, everyone that I knew thought that fall was terrible. It was a huge disappointment. They hated it. Apparently, the leaves had fallen too early. They had changed colors too early. Everything was wrong. Over the years, I have come to understand what constitutes a good autumn and what does not. I agree that there are some years where the change of the leaves goes a little too quickly, and in retrospect, I understand that year was indeed bad. It should not be snowing so much that Halloween trick-or-treating is canceled by the local government. I didn't know that because my dad said that footballs were brown so you could find them in the snow. I thought it was supposed to be snowing. I didn't know. I thought that what I experienced that first fall was amazing until someone else told me about the shortcomings. And I wonder, beloveds, how much do we do that about Unitarian Universalism? Over the years, I've come to understand that many UUs welcome newer congregants, and I see we have a lot of visitors today, and I'm glad you're here for this. Let me inoculate you a little. Because UUs tend to explain Unitarian Universalism by talking about what things are not. We are not this. We do not do that. We also things that we no longer do. Gripes and complaints of how things have changed over the years. It is possible that we are the only religious tradition that largely defines itself in terms of what it is not, rather than just letting people be happy with what they find here and building on what is. The challenge of defining ourselves has become even more difficult these last few years due to some major systemic changes in Unitarian Universalism. So for my benefit, and possibly your own, considering how long this sermon is at the moment, how many of you have been on your journey with Unitarian Universalism for 5 years or less? If you would please raise your hand. Yeah, okay, so we're gonna do the whole thing. Great. Okay, so Unitarian Universalism is in the midst of big changes in our culture and the way that we conceptualize who we are. In a way, this started in 2017 when an established Unitarian Universalist professional was passed over for a regional lead position with the UUA. She was highly qualified, she was experienced, and she felt she'd been passed over for the position because of her racial identity. She is Latina, specifically Boricua Chicana. And the person who was hired was a white man. And the reason given for the hiring choice was the ever elusive goodness of fit. This language was felt by many, including me, to be an expression of white supremacy culture. It launched an exploration of the ways that white supremacy culture operated within the systems of Unitarian Universalism within our culture. This is a gross oversimplification of what happened. There's a lot that's been written on it. It's easy to find online. At the same time that these events were happening in Unitarian Universalism, our nation was experiencing a similar reckoning. This includes the movement for Black lives, the protests after the deaths of Michael Brown, George Floyd, and so much more. Our nation and our association were both grappling with questions of white supremacy culture. And then there was COVID-19 on top of all of that. It's been a long, hard 5 years, grappling with all of these things concurrently. In our association, the questions of racial bias coalesced into two different but related movements. One response was the rise of the Eighth Principle Project, which was and is a grassroots movement that encouraged congregations to individually adopt an explicitly anti-racist, anti-oppressive eighth principle to the existing 7 principles. Many congregations, including this one, began work on exploring that addition of the eighth principle, which required a lot of soul searching for the congregation, the people in it. Locally and nationally, these efforts were complicated by the pandemic, all happening at the same time. And congregations that were just starting to consider if adding an eighth principle was right for them were suddenly forced into survival mode by the pandemic and the subsequent shutdown orders. The other response to the question of how to uncover and root out white supremacy culture in Unitarian Universalism was a UUA commission to study the second article of the Unitarian Universalist Association's bylaws. This clause of our bylaws is where the language of the 7 principles was housed. That's where it was written up. A study commission was convened in the fall of 2020 after the UUA Board of Trustees spent a few years selecting members and developing the charge. The charge was based on the discernment and the voting at the 2018-2019 General Assemblies. In 2023, the commission delivered their recommendation that rather than update the 7 principles or add a new 8th principle, the second article of the UUA's bylaws should be entirely rewritten. They introduced a set of 6 values centered on love. And that would become the way that we conceptualize Unitarian Universalism instead of the 7 principles, or perhaps in addition to. This recommendation was put to a vote at our General Assembly in 2024, which passed. Members of our association then spent a year developing and submitting amendments to the language, following another vote to fine-tune that language this past summer. It's an ongoing process still. It's a big change that's taken a long time. For a lot of people, the news of a proposed move away from 7 principles towards 6 values came kind of out of nowhere. Although all of that work was happening, it wasn't readily apparent that that work was happening to a lot of us because we were exhausted and our attention was elsewhere. So it landed as a surprise. A lot of people didn't know the study commission existed, what they were doing, or why, and so therefore their processes and the proposed changes didn't register. And I can take accountability for when I was so busy trying to keep my congregation afloat, trying to keep my family afloat, and keeping up with the constantly changing COVID safety guidelines that it totally surprised me. I can tell you, I knew a lot about MERV filters and KN95 masks at the time. And then this information came and I was like, wait, what? I missed it because I was paying attention to something else. I didn't know that there was this commission. I didn't expect the recommendation would be to move away from the language of the 7 principles entirely. I have the benefit, though, of having a high level of trust in processes. I was able to work through my initial surprise pretty easily. I tend to believe that when we gather folks, lay people and religious leaders, and we give them a question to think through or something to wrestle with, that I can usually accept their findings. They've had the time, the resources, and the attention for this issue that I didn't have. Again, MERV filters and KN95s, that's what I knew about. Plus, Unitarian Universalists get to vote. If a group of people come together with the right intention and they come up with a solution and we vote it down, that's okay. But that's not what happened. It passed. If the majority of the delegates are in favor of something, I'm usually going to be able to get behind it. The initial vote during that 2024 General Assembly was 80% in favor of the change. This was not a squeaker. It was a clear call. I have faith in our association, and by that I don't mean Boston. I don't mean headquarters. I mean us, as a people, as a voting body. I have faith that UUs will be thoughtful and scrupulous in decision making. As long as I have confidence in the process, typically I can accept the outcome. And that's been true for me here. But this is where it was really hard for me personally. Before coming to UCFW, I spent 18 months working as a membership professional in one of our larger congregations. It was my job to lead new member classes and to train lay folks in how to lead newcomer welcome meetings and to fill in for them occasionally. And I love that type of work, but man, it is hard to know how to talk about Unitarian Universalism in the midst of all this change without defaulting, well, we're not this and we're not that. And nobody wants to hear what you're not. The default for myself and for my team of lay folks had always been to talk about the 7 principles. And my time in that role was concurrent with all these changes and figuring everything out. We weren't all the way through the process yet, so we couldn't just switch gears to talking about 6 values the way we were accustomed to talking about 7 principles. All that we could do was invite visitors into the questions with us by explaining we're in the middle of a change process, and I have to tell you, that is not an appealing membership pitch. We don't know what the future holds. Get in the boat, it's going to be fine. People don't buy that. What became obvious to me during this time was that nobody ever really became a UU because of the 7 principles. There are plenty of people who are drawn to a UU congregation because of the principles. There are people who may find them deeply meaningful and have constructed a life around them. I'm not saying they don't have value, but the 7 principles are not how people become woven into the fabric of a congregation. And I promise you, nobody is going to become a UU because of the 6 values either. Those values are intellectually appealing, they're spiritually instructive, they are beautiful guideposts for ethical living, but the way that we conceptualize Unitarian Universalism is not now, nor has it ever been, what makes people be UUs. It's UUs that make people want to be UUs. The concepts, the principles, and values, they have meaning and they inspire us, and we get attached to them, but they are not Unitarian Universalism. They are forms strongly associated with Unitarian Universalism, but they are not Unitarian Universalism. They are a container. They are not the contents. After I had been living in New England for a while and I had come to understand the difference between a good autumn and a disappointing one, I heard a piece on NPR about what causes the leaves to change. The prevailing theory amongst my grumbling friends and neighbors was that climate change was ruining the fall foliage, and people were actually getting into disagreements with each other about personal culpability for driving large gas-powered cars. And as a longtime and unrepentant SUV driver, I was more than a little bit uncomfortable with the implication that I was somehow responsible for the disappointing fall. So my ears really pricked up at this news article. And it turns out that, yes, temperature is a trigger for leaves to change color, but even more so is the change in the light associated with the equinox. When our part of the planet tilts away from the sun, the decreased light causes deciduous leaves to slow down the process of photosynthesis, thus changing colors. It is undeniable that the average temperature of the Earth is changing. There are real consequences for the planet, including unpredictable temperatures. But there is also a constant that has not and will not ever change. the quality of the light as the earth tilts toward and away from the sun. There is something inherently poetic about the nature of light being a constant in our world. We are a living tradition. That is said with capital L's and T's. A living tradition, meaning that we change over time on purpose. That's what it is to be a Unitarian Universalist. That's what a liberal religious tradition is. It's not a political affiliation. It means liberal, always changing. Changing to meet the moment is a part of our theological inheritance, and yes, it is hard. What makes us still us over the decades and the centuries is not how we do things. It's not what we believe, and it's definitely not what we don't believe. It's who we are as a people. We are a people of deep questions. We are a people who answer the call to action for justice. We are a people who center relationships, the primacy of relationships. That is what makes us UUs. Perhaps the best innovation of our new Article 2 language is to put love at the center explicitly. Love has always been at the center, but now we've spelled that out. This is historically true for Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists. We have long been a people of covenant, that is, a people who value relationships and the promises that we make to each other over and against any test of faith, any creed or doctrine. To say that it's been a challenging 5 or so years is an understatement. The pace of change has been relentless, both within Unitarian Universalism and without, and particularly within this specific congregation. The constant exposure to emotionally charged information has taken a toll on us. The call to always do more, to be more, has taken a toll on us, leaving our nervous systems completely overwhelmed, which is why I'm really excited about introducing more silence to worship services, so we can regulate, co-regulate. Now is the time for us to prioritize putting love at the center of everything we do, love for each other, love for humanity, love for the planet. It's who we've always been, and it's who we'll continue to be. The container changes, but the contents, a liberal religious tradition founded on mutual care over mutual belief, that will always remain the same. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.